Good afternoon. Welcome to the GMC September membership meeting. I'm Greg Marcus, chair of the GMC and president and CEO of Marcus Corporation. I hope everyone had a relaxing and healthy summer. While our initial plan was to be back in person for this meeting, due to the Delta variant and the lower rate of vaccination in our region, we find it safest to meet virtually for the time being. So here we are, back on Zoom. Yuck. Okay, that was a little editorial comment. For those of you that know, the stuff is written for me. They did not write yuck in there. I did it myself. We encourage you all to support vaccine efforts and safe return to work plans by offering vaccine clinics for employees. I think it's clear vaccination is our path out of this mess. All the data shows this to be the case. I'm sure Dr. Amon will speak to that later. If you'd like more information about anything vaccine and COVID related, visit healthymke.com for more information. That's HELTHYMKE.com. Today, I welcome a few special guests, including Mayor Barrett and Common Council President Johnson. Thank you for joining us. One quick announcement before introducing our first guest speaker. The search committee is progressing with national search firm Egon Zehnder to find the next GMC president. We're meeting regularly, and the search is progressing. The committee is chaired by Mary Ellen Stanek, Greg Wesley, and Christy Garcia Thomas, and I want to express my deep gratitude to them for taking the lead on what is one of this organization's most important efforts. Finding our next leader is extremely important. I'm not sure they take my calls anymore, but because I did make a big ask of them, but I appreciate them for stepping up when I did. So, but good news, this is not Julia's last meeting, so don't say your goodbyes, not quite yet. We'll let you know, and we're going to, of course, find ways to celebrate Julia as well and all of her contributions to our community, which have been so substantive. And now for today's speakers. This meeting's focus is about successful collaboration. Before we invite our keynote guests, Rip Rapson and Kevyn Orr, to present, we welcome Ian Apston and Michael Hosted to share how Home Group and the GMC are collaborating on a regional leadership development and civic leadership succession strategy. In addition to Home Group and the GMC, many of our members have collaborated on Forward 48 by participating as faculty or recommending emerging leaders within the organization for the program. Welcome, Ian and Michael.
Thanks, Greg. Good to be here with you all today. As Greg mentioned, we're excited to be launching Forward 48, our third cohort, and just wanted to remind you all that applications are open. They close on September 24th. The cohort this year runs from October 6th through November 10th, runs every Wednesday in the evening, and we share Greg's sentiments. We are, in fact, virtual for, once again, our third cohort, but we have a great faculty group lined up, which Ian's going to talk about in a minute, and we'll just go to that right now. Ian, you want to talk about the faculty?
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for coming to us from a shoe closet, apparently.
Yeah, you like this? Yeah, we're in Kohler today.
Good way to pitch it. Good way to pitch it. Well, I'll be short and quick, and then I'm going to kick it over to a short video with people featured that have far more credibility than either Michael or I. So here's our faculty. These are the rock stars within today's business community that have agreed to share their wisdom and knowledge to the next 48 participants. So we are looking for the next rock stars within your company. The average age of attendee is about 32. And they have an opportunity to learn from Barry Alvarez, Barry Mandel, Dr. Joan Prince, Grady Crosby, Jonas Priesing, Julia Taylor, Ted Kellner, and Thelma Sias. And with that, we will kick it over to Heather for the video.
It takes honesty to realize that the leadership that many of us have come through and experienced is a leadership of the past.
To make change, you have to start with people first, right? No matter how large the scale of change has to become, it starts with a small group of people that believe in that vision, that believe that change is needed.
That if I link arms with people that are around me, if I expand my understanding of community and what that looks like, that there are great things that we can do together.
So as I think about, the work that we did in Forward 48 and the opportunities that we were presented with, now gives me this chance to reflect and say, are there other things that I can do?
I think we also have to create space for new leaders, new talent, innovation, entrepreneurship. So everything we can do to encourage that and to accelerate that, I think benefits us as a community.
One of the reasons I'm so excited about this program, because all of you naturally, either you self-selected in or others encouraged you to get involved with this program and apply. And so you're naturally inclined to try to help. And that's the part that I think, I think the goodwill of people trying to solve for the greater good, I'm optimistic.
Of taking that step in stepping into your own leadership. First and foremost, I would say self-leadership in learning more about potentially biases that you may have personally and learning about then from there moving into the problems and issues that are happening within our community and taking that activation to apply yourself with the emerging leaders that you meet within your cohort.
To be able to have those tools prepared for you through a program like this would be such a great way for you to jumpstart the impact that you can make.
So just a reminder, applications are open and you can apply online at forward48.com. If you're interested in reserving a spot, but you may not have someone identified, just email Ian or myself, and we're happy to ensure that we hold a spot for your diverse emerging leader to participate in Forward 48. So thanks again.
Thank you, Ian and Michael. On a similar note, the GMC is also a collaborating partner with Harvard Business School and a dozen cities across the nation on the Young American Leaders Program, or YELP. Again, we've had many members engage with YELP, including John Kissinger and Grafe as a leading sponsor and many others as selection committee members. Here to speak about the success of YELP is Jasmine Johnson.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, and thank you to the GMC for this opportunity to come before you today and represent the amazing cohorts of the 2021 YELP participants. As you can see, some of the names on the screen here, I'm pretty sure are quite familiar of the next generation of leadership that are already making our own right here in our community. If we can go to the next slide. I just wanted to take this opportunity also to just say thank you to those that were on the search committee and those that are really behind forging the opportunity for several of us through the 2021 cohort and those that participated before us in the Harvard Business School YELP program. It was a great way to engage and meet not just other dynamic professionals here in the greater Milwaukee area, but to connect with 10 other cities as we really shared best practices and heard from other thought leaders and faculty at Harvard Business School of what we can do collectively across the nation, but even more so, building a bridge amongst ourselves. So the task that we were given was to come up with kind of our positioning phrase as a cohort of what we wanted to do to leave our fingerprints behind. And what we had came up together as a team was here in Milwaukee, the next generation of intentional change makers will come together to create talent development, advocacy, and advancement for underrepresented populations and hold private and public decision makers accountable in order to achieve equitable representation in leadership and social influence. While there's so many amazing things and programs and development opportunities that are already taking place, we didn't believe that it was necessary to reinvent the wheel. But what could we do to partner with organizations and entities such as the GMC and maybe look at, through the collective leadership with the GMC membership base of how we can better work together in concert and just more of a orchestrated account with all of the initiatives that are going on in the community, such as the Region of Choice, where over 100 of CEOs and members of the MMAC have pledged to increase representation of African American and Hispanic managers and above in the next several years. But not just stopping at the 15%, but what can we do from the civic engagement of the GMC and the leadership here to really allow greater exposure for those intentional traditional change makers that make up, unrepresented populations to have a seat at the table and a voice through the selection process that goes on with a lot of the leadership opportunities here in the greater Milwaukee area. But looking at ways that we can connect from advocating on pay equity, or even increasing the wealth of all parties and communities that make up this dynamic and great city. So thank you again for the opportunity to participate. And I would just call out, one of the opportunities that we have as a cohort is just pay attention to this Friday's edition of the Milwaukee Business Journal as we work together to showcase the unfamiliar faces of professionals of color and showcase to the business community that here in Greater Milwaukee, for a region of choice for everyone, there's an opportunity for professionals of color that are already here and that do exist to take the next opportunity of leadership within our professional and also our civic and volunteering capacities. So thank you again for the opportunity to present and share what we from the 2021 YELP cohort have come up with, and look forward to engaging with each and every one of you of how we can make and connect with you all to continue the great work that's already taken place. Greg, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Jasmine. These programs are a great example of successful collaboration, and we look forward to the future of our community and organizations at the helm of leaders who understand how to successfully collaborate. And now I want to welcome Dr. John Raymond, President and CEO of the Medical College of Wisconsin, to share our monthly COVID-19 update.
Thanks, Greg, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to do something a little bit different today, and I'll begin and end with some key takeaways. And in the middle, I'll provide you the supporting data. If I could go to the first slide, please. I'll start with a summary of the United States and then move on to the COVID-19 pandemic in Wisconsin. In the US, we're in the middle of the fourth or fifth wave, and it is now flattening. And there's a mixture of hard-hit states that are showing some improvements and some less hard-hit states with increasing cases. And our daily case counts are approximating about 150,000. And compare and contrast that with the third wave, in which we were having 250,000 daily case reported. Hospitalizations in the US also are beginning to flatten, with about 100,000 in the hospital now with a diagnosis of COVID-19. Deaths unfortunately continue to rise, and recall that those lag several weeks behind the diagnosis at about 1,500 per day in our country. And I do want to say that I would expect the deaths to start going down more quickly now than previously in the pandemic because the Delta variant makes people sicker quicker. And so you would expect that that lag in deaths would be shorter than it was earlier in the pandemic. Now I'm going to move on to Wisconsin and talk about very preliminary evidence. And please, I stress very preliminary, that there is a flattening or a deceleration of the COVID-19 Delta variant surge here in Wisconsin. So hospitalizations and ICU utilization by COVID-19 patients are still high, but they are flattening. Deaths continue to rise and probably will continue to rise for at least the next several weeks. And I do want to emphasize that the burden of COVID-19 disease remains very high in Wisconsin. Wisconsin hospitals are full, with a high baseline of non-COVID-19 patients and with the highest census of COVID-19 patients since January of this year. ICUs are now at 94% capacity, with only 81 ICU beds available in Wisconsin yesterday and 31 in the southeastern Wisconsin region, or HERC-7. Compare and contrast that with the worst moments that we had in the November, the third surge, in which our ICUs were at 95% capacity and hospitals were slightly over 90% full. So we actually have a situation similar to what we had in November in terms of flexibility. But the good news is that many of the patients in the hospital are not infected with COVID. We're seeing a recovery of clinical volumes back to pre-pandemic levels, and there is a pent-up demand for deferred and delayed care and surgeries that is being met right now. What that means, though, is that we are really perilously close to reaching capacity in our healthcare systems. So everything that we can do to minimize the burden on our healthcare providers and our health systems is going to be good. And that would include getting flu shots if they become available here over the next several weeks. Now, if I could go to the next few slides, next slide. Again, please understand that these data were pulled yesterday and that there are critical reporting lags that happen every weekend. So we're going to caveat these key takeaways, especially when you think about both the numbers and the apparent trends relevant to COVID-19, which could be skewed by reporting lags. Also, with school starting and some employers beginning phased return to work, continuing vigilance and attention to these numbers is highly advisable. Now, with those caveats, I'll start in the upper left. Our 7-day average for daily new cases in Wisconsin is 1,538. Again, higher than any of the surges that we had except for the third surge. There is evidence, though, that the acceleration that we've seen over the last few weeks is beginning to flatten, although the overall trend has still remained unfavorable. So it'll be interesting to see what the numbers show us today when they're reported at 2 o'clock. Positivity by test actually starting, even though it says trending unfavorably, looks like it may be trending favorably. We were running in the 8 to 9% range, and we were at 7.7% over the weekend. And our R value, which is a measure of contagiousness, has dipped below 1. Again, this is a single data point on a weekend. And please note that for the previous week, the R was over 1. So again, it'll be interesting to see what the data show today. In terms of the 14-day increase in cases, we're flat. And we're the 22nd worst, or 22nd best state. So we are in the middle of the pack, trending like the rest of the US, but 2 to 3 weeks behind. We have had a 29% 14-day increase in hospitalizations, and that is the 6th worst state. So again, showing the lags that we know happen between diagnosis and then hospitalization and deaths. On the bad news side, and Greg kind of alluded to this, we're now 27th in vaccinations, either as measured by 1 dose or completing the course. And recall that January, February, and March, we were actually leading the country and we're in the top 5 in terms of completed doses. So we have some work to do here. Also, I want to interpose just a healthy dose of skepticism about what appear to be favorable trends. Because if we're not doing materially better in terms of vaccination than other states, we can't really expect to do significantly better than states around us or states that are 2 to 3 or 4 weeks ahead of us. So again, the numbers this week are actually going to be critical for solidifying the flattening trend, or to understand that this was just an aberration and that we're still on the upslope. Next slide, please. Next slide, we'll talk about hospitalizations and deaths. And I want to say that the hospital data are not current. They were from Friday, the last available day that the Wisconsin Hospital Association updated the data. So again, the numbers today will be important. We'll start on the upper left. The 7-day average deaths are at 13, and those are definitely trending unfavorably. 4 out of the last 5 days, we had 19 or more deaths reported in Wisconsin. And recall that back in June, we were only having a couple of deaths per week reported in Wisconsin. And again, this isn't surprising. Even if hospitalizations or cases start to flatten, there's going to be a lag of a couple of weeks before the deaths start to turn down as well. We have over 1,000 people in the hospital now, and that clearly is still trending unfavorably. Compare that, though, to our peak of nearly 2,300 hospitalizations with COVID-19 patients in mid-November. And you can see that just in terms of the burden of disease of hospitalized COVID-19 patients, we're doing better. But again, our hospitals are full of non-COVID-19 patients. ICU census shows similar trends at 322, again, trending slightly unfavorably, but appearing to slow down somewhat. And this is about 70% of the peak that we saw back in November of 2020. Milwaukee trends are very similar. Deaths were less than 1 per week, and they're at 3 deaths per day and trending unfavorably. So that's something to keep an eye on. But our hospitalizations are tracking along with the Wisconsin data. Next slide, please. This, you've seen this before. This is a slide showing screenshots from the Wisconsin Department of Health Services website showing the burden of disease in Wisconsin's 72 counties over time. Red is bad, dark blue is bad, but not quite as bad. And as you move toward lighter blues, that shows a lower burden of disease. And what you can see is that in November, we were in serious trouble. 66 of our 72 counties had critically high levels of COVID-19 cases being diagnosed on a daily basis. We started to have vaccinations in earnest in January and February. And you can see by early March 2021, we were having a clear deceleration and a drop in case burdens in most of our counties that really continued to trend through late June and early July. But then there was an uptick as Delta started to penetrate our state like it did the rest of the US. And what you see is last Wednesday's graph on the far right, showing that 16 counties have a high burden of disease and 56 counties, including the counties around us, with a very high burden of disease. Again, very preliminary evidence suggested that there aren't actually very many counties with an unfavorable trajectory. Most of our counties were sort of sitting in a holding pattern. So again, it is possible that although I would have not expected this to happen for at least a couple of more weeks, that we may be peaking now in Wisconsin. Next slide, please. And again, this is the summary slide again. Just want to make sure that everyone is aware that here in Wisconsin, we have preliminary evidence of flattening or deceleration of COVID-19, but we need to pay attention to the numbers this week. Our hospitalizations and ICU use are very high, but flattening. And deaths continue to rise, and we know that that's going to be a trend that we'll see for several weeks. And the burden of disease remains high in Wisconsin. With reopening of schools, with people going back to work, and with colder weather upon us, it's incumbent on us to continue to use mitigation measures to try to reduce the community burden of COVID-19. Again, our hospitals are full with a high baseline of non-COVID-19 patients, and we want to be able to provide the best care to everybody, whether they have COVID-19 or not. So we've got to do everything we can to try to make sure that we don't overwhelm the hospital census and our capacity, which at this time, there's not a whole lot of wiggle room left for us, either in terms of ICU or hospital beds. And the next slide simply shows the usual data sources that we use. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Greg.
Hey, Dr. Raymond, it's Julia. I'm going to go ahead and take the reins here. We really appreciate your very sobering update. And speaking of collaboration, we really appreciate the updates that you shared during July and August by email as well. We also got great comments from our members on that. And as both you and Greg mentioned, safe return to work and vaccine efforts are going to be increasingly important with the Delta variant and the colder season we have approaching. So we appreciate those who have taken a lead on vaccine and mask mandates in the workplace. And again, we're happy to share your reopening strategies as they progress. So now we'll move on to the GMC initiative updates. On innovation and talent, the Common Teens had a very busy summer working with over 200 students from Milwaukee and Northwestern Indiana on a virtual career accelerator program. These programs were a collaboration with the City of Milwaukee's Earn and Learn program and Employ Milwaukee. We also want to congratulate Michael Hostad on accepting a position with the new organization. Michael's commitment and impact over the past 7 years at the GMC has been crucial to the growth of Milwaukee's talent pipeline and leadership development. We're going to miss you, Michael, but we certainly wish you well with your next venture. Thank you very much for all you've done. Economic prosperity. Scale Up Milwaukee's in its 7th round of the Growth Accelerator, focusing on growing businesses between 1 to 10 million in revenue. Scale Up continues to work closely with the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation on the Growth Accelerator for job and economic growth in our region. In addition, Scale Up's hosting its 6th cohort of Spark, which is similar to the Growth Accelerator, but focused on Black, Hispanic, and women business owners with businesses of under 1 million in revenue. Milwaukee United was recently awarded a $200,000 grant from the Kresge Foundation to support its work in the coming year. And we are in the beginning phases of a few new projects that will impact equitable housing. And we look forward to sharing more information on these soon. Vibrancy of Place, the Beerline Trail feasibility study was received, which is putting us one step closer to the capital campaign. Thank you to those members who agreed to be interviewed and to our partners who are working so diligently on this project. And other exciting news, a $1.5 million earmark was submitted for a portion of the Beerline Trail development by Congressional Representative Kevyn Orr, and we hope to hear the confirmation of the earmark soon. And now I'd like to introduce today's keynote guest speakers, Rip Rapson and Kevyn Orr, to talk about successful collaboration between the private and public sectors, accelerating the resurgence of Detroit through and post-bankruptcy. Like many of the initiative updates I've shared, similar collaborations are happening here locally. And it's our hope that further insight from Rip and Kevyn, we will be better able to understand the opportunity and the capacity of these partnerships. Rip knows both sides of the public-private partnership well, both in his role as Deputy Mayor of Minneapolis until 1993, and then in his role as President and CEO of the Kresge Foundation in 2006. He has led the foundation to adopt an array of grant-making and investing tools to improve the economic, social, cultural, and environmental conditions of urban life through grant-making and social investing in Kresge's hometown of Detroit, as well as a few other urban areas, Rip. Nationally, he's strengthened the philanthropic sector's role through convening, collaborating, and supplementing community development activities in cities throughout the country. He is a visual systems thinker, and he can create amazing graphical representation of complex systems and how to make new concepts work within these systems. If you ever get a chance to see any of his drawings, they're really amazing. Myself and a number of others in Milwaukee, including Ellen Gilligan, Susan Lloyd, and Greg Wesley, have had the wonderful opportunity to work closely with Rip directly on this journey to create equitable economic prosperity in our cities. Through Rip, Kresge created the American Cities Practice 6 years ago, and we were invited to be a part of the original cohort of cities and national thought leaders to share ideas and effective practices and policies. Many of our best ideas in Milwaukee United, including the collaborative Brew City Match, came from the Kresge Foundation and your work in Detroit and the other cohort cities. Kresge Foundation's been an early believer and important financial supporter in Milwaukee United. In Detroit, Rip and the foundation provided central support to the Grand Bargain, which is what we're going to hear about today, an unprecedented partnership between the philanthropic community, city pensioners, the state of Michigan, and the Detroit Institute of Art to propel the city of Detroit's successful emergence from municipal bankruptcy in 2014. Kevyn Orr is the other partner in this Grand Bargain. He's partner in charge of the U.S. offices of Jones Day. Prior to rejoining Jones Day, Kevyn served as the emergency manager of the city of Detroit and was charged with restructuring the city's finances and operations. And I think, as you'll hear today, it was not an easy task, and nor was Kevyn always a popular person in the early days of this. But Detroit was very fortunate that they had Kevyn. During his tenure, he oversaw the largest and most complicated municipal bankruptcy proceeding in its nation's history, and the city successfully restructured $18 billion in debt, reduced overall debt by $7 billion, developed and implemented a multi-year $1.7 billion revitalization plan for city services and operations, streamlined city operations, helped improve public safety, put the city's art on a perpetual public trust, and avoided drastic cuts to pensions and related retiree benefits. Kevyn received the Turnaround Management Association's Mega Transaction of the Year Award. I bet you they haven't given too many more of those, for the city of Detroit, Michigan in October 2015. Following their presentation, Ellen Gilligan, President and CEO of the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, will conduct a Q&A with Rip and Kevyn, and we ask the members to use the Q&A box to submit their questions during the presentation. So please welcome Rip Rapson and Kevyn Orr.
Well, thank you, Julia. Let me get us started. First, just a deep expression of appreciation to the organization. To have Julia work on the national scene with us has been one of the great pleasures of my time at Kresge. She is, as you all know, don't need me to tell you, a huge champion of all things Milwaukee. And she represents you in the finest way in all of the national conversations that we've structured that have involved Milwaukee. And I also want to, sort of in anticipation, thank Ellen. I think it's safe to say that Ellen is in the handful of finest community foundation administrators in the country. She is universally respected. So to have two such extraordinary talents with this kind of passion for your community in the mix is just a huge gift, and one that we from the outside certainly appreciate. Let me just say that we're going to talk about Detroit, and actually we're going to talk about Detroit of maybe 10 years ago, but not because Milwaukee is Detroit, because it is anything but that. And not because it suggests that there are sort of strong parallels between exactly what we did in Detroit and what you and your colleagues in Milwaukee are trying to do. But I think because more than those things, it's because there was sort of a way of coming at complex problem solving. And I thought that I would kind of get us started talking a little bit about how philanthropy sort of set the stage for some of Kevyn's work. But I'm going to try to get out of the way pretty quickly, because you have, as Julia suggested, one of the handful of most talented municipal players in the world. Kevyn is unprecedented in his skill and in his passion for urban areas, and he is in demand anytime an urban area is sort of struggling with both current and future challenges. So he's the real show, and I'm going to try to step aside as quickly as I can. But let me roll back the tape, if I might, to 2008 and 2009. All American cities were struggling, certainly Milwaukee as well. But Detroit was struggling in a particular way, not just with the Great Recession, but with the pending bankruptcies and sort of catastrophic disruption to the automobile supply chain, not just the big three, but all the way down the waterfall of supply. And of course, Detroit was the epicenter of that. You add on to that the housing foreclosure crisis in a community like Detroit, where so many of its homeowners and renters were at huge risk. And then you add to that a mayor who was indicted on God knows how many counts of corruption and ended up going to the penitentiary. Forgive the cliche, but it was really something. I remember getting a call from my board asking for a special session. My board at Kresge has 3 or 4 folks from Detroit, but the majority, 9 or 10, are not from Detroit. And they read the same newspapers as you all do and could see what dire circumstances Detroit found itself in, and basically asked, what's the end game? Why would Kresge, where it can work anywhere in the country, choose a place like Detroit? And I explained the obvious, which is it's our hometown. It's where Sebastian Kresge made his fortune and began his five and dime enterprise that later became Kmart. But more importantly than that, because there was an opportunity for us to demonstrate that if Detroit could climb out of this circumstance, so could any community in America. And so many of the issues that we were struggling with were emblematic of other places in America. And Kevyn will probably talk a little bit about that. But the board was skeptical, and it began suggesting to me that we had a real crisis of articulating what it was we sought to do and how. And that was tough when essentially the private sector was in a bunker and the public sector was essentially in the penitentiary, and the nonprofit sector was really hanging on by a thread. There just weren't very many people left standing. And that was reinforced actually a couple of weeks after those board calls by a call I got from the White House. Eric Douglas, who was on the Council of Domestic Advisors to President Obama, said to me that he had just gotten off of a call. No, it wasn't a call, actually. He had just gotten out of a cabinet meeting. That's right, a cabinet meeting in which President Obama had basically said that he would not permit Detroit to become the Katrina on his watch. And so Derek said to me, we got to do something to be helpful. So we want to come and have a press conference. And I said, well, that's great. That's terrific. What are you going to announce? And he said, well, I have no idea. I said, well, that's not very helpful. And he said, well, the problem is that it's so incoherent and confused and bodies lying every which way. You got to tell us what we need to do. Well, for the White House to be taking suggestion from us, I guess, is a welcome thing. So I went back and as Julia suggested, I did one of these goofy drawings that I do that tried to sort of capture whether there was sufficient energy in the city to actually have a holding pattern until both the public and the private sector sort of got back on their feet and regained their rightful role. And turns out that between some private sector effort, particularly from Dan Gilbert from Quicken Loans and Roger Penske from Penske Automotive and a handful of other civic corporate leaders and philanthropy, there was actually a body of work that was pretty powerful and that we felt could, if invested in properly and executed on strategically, sort of carry us through a time in which people got back into the game. It was actually 9 bodies of work. It seems like a lot, but when you think about it, it was pretty fundamental. We were working on trying to create a new public transit system. We needed to keep that going. We were trying to develop a system of land use that would somehow come at the enormous issues of blight and abandonment of property in Detroit. At one point, we had over 100,000 blighted and abandoned properties in a city of 700,000 people. It was trying to figure out how to stabilize our commercial corridors that were bleeding in every which way. It was an exercise in trying to develop a system of small business supports in a town that had traditionally been a command and control economy, where the big 3 automakers basically spec'd out to their suppliers what needed to be done. And there was very little tradition of entrepreneurship and small business development. And so we, to make a very long story short, we began sort of systematically trying to lay out those workflows and trying to figure out who among us had the capacity, the leadership capacity, the resources, the financial resources to create enough energy to keep the lights on. And I could talk at length about all of those or any of those, but I think what I'd rather do, just to hand it off to Kevin, is suggest that what emerged from this sort of 2008 to 2013 time when Kevin entered the scene were a series of roles that philanthropy ended up playing together with its private sector partners, which for me were almost as important as the particular transactions we ended up investing in, because the roles could actually endure beyond the bankruptcy. And actually, when Kevin asked me to testify in the bankruptcy hearing before Judge Rhodes, that was exactly the question Judge Rhodes put to me. It was, it's great that you've done all of these things over the last 5 years, but how have you worked, and do you propose continuing to work in that way going forward when the issues change, when the mayor has different priorities and the like? Let me just tick those off very quickly, and we can certainly come back to them. One was just the basic act of table setting, having a neutral convener around issues that were essentially third rail issues for the public sector, in particular land use. It was such a fraught set of issues. No one wanted to talk about not investing in certain parts of the city, or closing down certain commercial corridors, or not investing in housing in certain areas of the city. But we, to make a very long story short, underwrote a multi-year land use planning process that ends up being essentially the roadmap both through the bankruptcy and afterward. Second was trying to help build civic decision-making capacity. When we began, there was not a single community development finance institution in the city of Detroit. So we went to work trying to both build local capacity and draw into Detroit national CDFIs who could help make sure that small scale capital infusions were going to continue during a time when there was no money to be had. Third was peeling away the first layer of risk from really tough but essential transactions, commercial, housing, and otherwise, to help the private sector see that there was actually an entry point into the work. We chose probably a dozen key projects, poured philanthropic high-risk money into it, and that ended up, I think, sending a very strong message into the private sector that they could join the market once again. Fourth was serving as what I call a guarantor of value, investing in a suite of common spaces that, again, signaled to the private sector that Detroit was an investable proposition. Our Riverwalk, our downtown Campus Martius Park, our light rail system, all of these, I think, were very powerful indications for businesses looking to the long term that we were actually going to have the kind of the amenity structures that any town needs, and so many towns take for granted. Fifth, we could become sort of a Sherpa. We could become a bridge to national resources. The federal government, as the call from the White House indicates, needed someone to talk to. They needed someone to ground truth, what was going on in the city. You know, could we move this way? Could we move that way? Is this person trusted? And that ended up being a really important conduit for talent, for money, for energy, and a whole suite of external actors ended up joining the fight, as I think, as a result of having a neutral third party able to sort of land some of that work. And finally, and not inconsiderably, we were able to in our arts and cultural fabric. The money for those sectors had completely dried up, and to have philanthropy and select private sector actors back away would have been the death knell for them all. And instead, I think what we went to work doing was building out a much more robust human services sector, a much more robust arts and cultural sector that became in many ways the lifeline for Detroit over those 5 years. So that took us up to about 2013. And then we really had trouble because all of a sudden we learned that Governor Snyder had approached the guy who's going to talk next about how to get Detroit not just out of the Great Recession, not out of the foreclosure crisis, not out of the political crisis, not out of the automobile crisis, but out of municipal bankruptcy, indeed the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. So let me hand it off to Kevin. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Rip, for handing it off, and that recitation. It was spot on to begin with. And I want to thank, Ellen and Greg and their team for inviting us to speak. One thing that Rip really spoke to, and I'd like to get to it, is strategic planning. He talked about the period from 2008 to 2013 when I came into the city, and I came into the city the week after the prior mayor, Kilpatrick, was sentenced to 28 years on a 116 count indictment by U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuaid for an epic level of fraud. She had recounted $75 million in theft. By my count, it was closer probably to $200 million in theft of bond funds and sewage sludge. But as you might imagine, the city was somewhat on tenterhooks given that recitation. But the reason I mention that is this process actually started with Governor Snyder, Rick Snyder, back in 2011 in his first term, when he started rolling out review teams, economic review teams at the state level to try to explain to the population and get buy-in, both at the state and at the city level, the magnitude of the problem and the structural issues that the city was confronting. And that was no mean feat. There was a historical split, shall we say, between Lansing, which was predominantly, I'm just going to be frank, white and Republican, and downriver Detroit, which was predominantly Democratic and African-American. The city was 82% African-American at that time, where there was a severe lack of trust. So a lot of folks, in terms of what he saw, both operationally, but also financially, and indeed what needed to be constructed, were skeptical. They were skeptical of the intent. They were skeptical of the effort. They were skeptical of the actor, meaning me. I had spent a significant portion of my professional career as a corporate lawyer representing large corporate institutions such as Chrysler, Bank of America, and others. Here you have this white-collar corporate guy coming into town in a city that needs some restructuring. Is he just here to, take the crown jewels and case the joint? Was some of the concern. And what I tried to do, explain to them is, first of all, I'd spent a third of my career in the public sector, 3 federal agencies, now 2 state government agencies, giving back in public service, but also growing up the son of an AME, African Episcopal minister, a 3rd generation. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, Reverend Dr. Alan E. Orr, were all AME ministers. I was pretty keyed in on the relationship of commitment and also fidelity to the people you're going to serve in public service. I would try to relay to them, at least the ecumenical council in the city, that I was essentially a sin eater. My goal was to come in and not get involved in the politics or the history of the city, but to report accurately on the state of affairs and to develop and construct a plan that would rectify. And as Rick mentioned, the real world word is looking backwards, addressing the prior issues that the community had to deal with, but doing it in a way that was sustainable for the foreseeable future. And sustainability is really a key watchword, because if you don't do it sustainable, economic cycles, Jamie Dimon over JP Morgan Chase will always point out, economic cycles run 7 to 10 years, 7 lean years, 7 fat years. They'll come and they'll go. But the one thing you want to be able to do is to adjust for that cyclicality, that change, so that going out, you have a sustainable portion. And when I came into the city, I said, okay, if I can take my private sector skills, I'm working for a company. When we did the Chrysler bankruptcy, we were trying to reconstruct the company, reorganize it so that it could produce automobiles, shed some legacy debt, but produce automobiles on a sustainable basis and competitive, not just with the other big 2, but with the others, almost 3 dozen automakers that were active at that time. And how are we going to do that? So I sort of brought that rhetorical question into myself. And looking at the city budget, I noticed that on the general fund budget, 3/4 of the general fund more or less was public safety, police, fire, EMTs. The authority budgets, principally water and lighting, were on a different side, but the general fund was principally a public safety business. And we weren't doing that particularly well in the city at the time, and had a very high crime rate. So you had to ask yourself, why? What do we need to do, both operationally, if EMTs aren't getting to someone in the first 45, then your mortality rate goes up from somewhere in the level of low double digits to 80% if you don't get there in 45. If you have a tier 1 crime call from police dispatch and the scout car doesn't show up for another 45, 50 minutes, then whatever event is transpiring at someone's home or at a gas station is over by the police get there. And that keys in not only just deterrence in crime, it also keys into your ability to solve those crimes, because evidence flees. So you look at just some basic metrics and say, what do we need to do to both deal with the balance sheet issues, which was the $7 billion of debt we had to shed, but also the operational issues, so that when we leave this city, there's some muscle memory and it's able to transit into a better day for the foreseeable future. I just took a brief look at Milwaukee's budget before this started, and let me just be clear. Every city is different. Every municipality is different. Milwaukee's not Detroit. Detroit's not Milwaukee. So I don't want to draw any parallels or any analogs between the cities. In fact, looking at the website, Milwaukee's very progressive and on top of it in terms of housing, outreach, education, inclusiveness. I see the mayor stood up in office last year for equity and inclusion. Milwaukee's really on a forward lean. But with that being said, when I looked at the budget, approximately 35% of the budget is police and fire. Another 21.64, 22% is water and sewer. 57% of the 2021 budget, more or less, is in those 3 categories: police, fire, water, and sewer. There's little elasticity in the budget. And if you look at the mayor's statement when he promulgated the budget last September, he was pretty direct and pretty focused. I mean, I understand he's been there 17 years. He's been nominated to go off to Luxembourg, but he seems like a very competent and highly focused mayor. You have a fortunate in that respect. But he noticed, the city lives on one source of taxes, which is property taxes. It gets revenue share, but in Detroit, we had 5 sources of taxes. We had income tax, property tax, sales tax, casino revenue, and state revenue share. Each one of those was 20%. So the Milwaukee budget is sort of captured by the fact that you really have the creedal source of revenue, which is your property tax. I understand that the mayor, has been asking for the state to address this issue. And in fact, cut back on public safety in the city last year to a degree to try to deal with the general fund budget issues. But the 120 positions that were not filled last year, apparently there'll be another 33 that will not be filled this year in 2021, going and cuts to the fire department. How does that play itself out? Well, the city is functioning quite well, but years going forward, that's a city service issue. Can you do that indefinitely? So when I think about public-private partnerships, some of this is what can the private sector do? Private sector is in the business of raising millage or running the city or working for the budget director, but the private sector is in the business of supporting the local community in things that they see as necessary to make the state's largest city, which, by the way, according to the National League of Governors, all cities, I think, account for somewhere between 65 to 70% of state revenue generation. I mean, you can't have an Illinois without a Chicago. You probably wouldn't have an Arizona without a Phoenix. California is a large state, so it has LA and San Francisco, but it can't survive alone with Sacramento or Sutter's Mill. Certainly Florida needs Miami, Jacksonville, Tampa, St. Pete. Cities are the lifeblood of states. And when your chief city administrator, the mayor, is saying, I need help. I need help to make this run. I need to have a sales tax. I need to have the state come in and assist me in providing for the elasticity that's necessary to run this state, because if I don't get it, there are going to be issues that we're going to confront. And let me just highlight one based upon the publicly available information. When the mayor took over 17 years ago, pension fund was at zero. It had no money. This is public safety pensions. The city was then required to fund, I think in 2010, $49 million in pension funding. In 2013, it went to 60 million. 2021, it was 71 million. The city's projection that by 2023 is that the city will have a $160 million pension funding obligation. It will double within the next 3 years. Okay, let me say that again, $160 million perhaps in a pension obligation. Against this obligation, the mayor and his staff can pull out only $8 million in contribution to the pension fund. Those are public safety pensions. Now, some of these numbers are adjustable. It depends on where you're invested. One of the things we did in Detroit, we had a GRS, General Services Fund. We had PFRS, Police and Fire Service Fund. And Police and Fire was funded a little bit better according to their actuarial responsibility at somewhere in the neighborhood of 83%, but the general fund was funded in the 70s. And we know in the years going out that if you don't reach at least 90% of funding, you're going to have a deficit in your pension funding, and that can drag your budget. That's a drag on your budget. But more important than that is, or equally important than that, I might say, is the rate at which you're assuming the funds are going to generate income, the accepted actuarial rate. The lowest one in municipalities contemporarily is 6.5% in DC. We left Detroit with the second lowest at 6.75. When we got there, the actuarial rate was 9% rate of return. That was anticipated almost 10%. But worse than that in the city was if there was a deficit between that projected 9% rate of return year over year, then the city was on the hook for that deficit. So in 2009, for instance, the actual rate of return to the city was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2%, but they had to agree to fund 9%. No, actually it was negative 20-some-odd%. They had to agree to fund 9% because that was financial crisis. That was a 29% delta. in 1 year, which created a massive deficit for pension underfunding. So the reason I mentioned that in terms of the alpha and the omega for what I've just seen at a 40,000 foot level in the Milwaukee budget is a lot of your budget is dedicated to public safety, but you have this emerging public safety pension obligation. And when people ask, what can we do in a public-private partnership? It's exactly what Rip said before. One is help provide an overview of what sustainability would look at and support the leaders who are saying openly, I mean, this isn't a public document, openly, these are the storm clouds on the horizon. We can deal with them if we get the help that we need. If we don't get the help that we need, the storm's coming. So in Detroit, I always say, you know, my purpose in coming in was to take the helm of the ship of state. Rip and his team, whether at Kresge or the other foundations, but also the business community, was to keep the bilge pumps pumping so this thing would stay afloat. My job was to get it to shore so that I could fix it, repair it so that it became seaworthy, and then make sure that it got out to sea again on a fair wind, on a broad reach, since you're a shoreline community. Those of you know what I'm saying. But as we all know, when you go to sea, you know, the sea is no place for the timid. The weather can change. So storm clouds will come again. In fact, in Detroit, which was doing quite well until the pandemic, the big hit was that the casino revenue went down because people weren't going to casinos. It's 1/5. Created a yearly budget deficit, I think 54 million, I think it was, Rip. But in the out years going out, that's only going to go further. And one of the components of what we did in Detroit was to allow the pensioners who went from a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan, and a reduction in terms of their pension obligations, but also a limit on what the city's obligation would do, is we allowed for the possibility for there to be pension restoration in 2024. But if you have this drag on the budget of a deficit that occurred because of the pandemic, and the possibility of a double tap coming on this year, as Doctor just said, coming into phase 4 or 5, that creates additional risk. So when I think of public-private partnerships, I think of first listening to what the people who are in charge, the mayor and his team of running the ship of state, are saying. 2, trying to figure out what all of us can do to support them in their mission, which is to provide services to the citizenry. And 3, try to strategize it so that you have a timeline, a strategy, if you will, a roadmap for how you're going to get there and who you're going to go with. Those were the things we tried to do. And in any restructuring, I say there are 3 phases. Phase 1 is the entry, assessment, and reporting out. You come in, you try to get your feet a little bit wet and understanding what's going on, and then you have transparency. You have to tell people the true state of affairs. You know, as Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain said, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. So I try to get the facts out there. So we can dispute ideology and what this means, but the reality is the world is not flat. The sun's going to rise tomorrow, and so let's deal with this. Number 2 is the assessment, sort of plan, design, and architecture, beta tests, field tests, and bench tests, and then rollout. And then the 3rd phase of all this is final assessment and exit strategy. You know, I always tell my clients when they come to me to talk about a restructuring, in court or out of court, I tell them, you know, something like a bankruptcy is really easy to get into, or a restructuring plan is easy to get into. The question from day one you have to ask yourself is, how do we get out of here? What does success look like? You know, what would the city look like with having a sales tax, having the ability, city of Milwaukee, to assess the burgeoning pension obligation that you could address for now and in the future? Because at bottom, the reality is, for those of us that are on this call, we're really not talking about the meat of our professional careers and our future. We're talking about our children's future. You know, what are we going to leave them in a country as successful and affluent as ours? what does that look like for them? So that's more or less my initial thinking, Rip. I didn't want to prattle on and didn't want to belabor Detroit too much, but I'm happy to take any questions or go further if anybody has it.
Ellen.
Here I am. Thank you, Kevin. And thank you so much, Rip. I guess this is my time to join the conversation. It's really a great honor to be able to try and moderate this really important question and answer portion of our program today. And I just want to add my thanks on behalf of the GMC for both of you being here today. And I also want to really thank and acknowledge Julia for inviting you. So I want to just take 30 seconds. I know this is not the time to honor Julia, but I just really want to thank Julia and acknowledge her visionary leadership of the GMC over the last 20 years. Julia and her leadership of the GMC has helped Milwaukee address some of the most pressing problems that we have and its greatest opportunities. And so it is the reason that you are both here. And so not only do you share this creative nature, Rip, with Julia, but your vision and ability to take on really pressing problems with bold leadership. So I also have to say a word about Rip because even though he won't say it ever, he's one of the greatest leaders in the country with his vision and understanding of cities and their role in expanding opportunity and creating an equitable society. So Rip, you have led boldly and advised not only the philanthropic sector, but the business sector and the public sector and cities across America. And we all owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude. And Kevin, before we had the opportunity to see you in person, Rip speaks of you as one of the most brilliant people he knows, and the only person who could lead the Detroit out of the bankruptcy restructuring. And clearly, having heard you for just a short period of time, we have seen that demonstrated. So we really appreciate you both being part of this conversation. So, you said that, Kevin, you gave such a remarkable view at a 40,000 foot level of some of the challenges facing Milwaukee with regard to its budget constraints and its revenue generation. And Rip, you outlined some very important roles for philanthropy to play, table setting, building a civic decision-making capacity, taking on risk, being the guarantor of value of common spaces, et cetera, being the Sherpa, I love that, the bridge to the national resources of investment, and the protector of other parts of the ecology of a city and human sector and arts and culture. So I'm going to start, if I might, with a couple of questions and then invite the group to join in. So we all know that Milwaukee is not Detroit, but there are some really important lessons that you have underscored for us all, not only as the analysis of the budget and the wins that might be coming our way and getting behind the private or the public sector leaders who understand these issues and help them pass sales tax and other things that can increase our revenue generation. But you have also talked about the importance of relationships, both before you got into a crisis and those that sustained the work going forward. You spoke a lot about sustainability, not only of the plan, but I think we are facing some leadership transitions in Milwaukee, not only with our mayor going to Milwaukee or to Luxembourg, but with Julia's departure. So I would want ask you each to speak about how relationships and partnerships and building a sustainable platform for long-term change. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, I'd be happy to field that. I mean, I think, you know, given the work Ellen and you, Julia, have been there for a long time in the city, you built up a lot of goodwill in the community, a lot of credibility in the community. And Julia just reminded me, for instance, that they've been trying to work with the state on a number of terms, number of years to address some of these issues. But like a lot of states, we used to always call it kicking the can down the road. They didn't. And I'll just relay an anecdote in terms of relationships. When I first came into the city, Rip and his cohort, meaning the foundation and philanthropy community, were willing to commit a significant hundreds of millions of dollars, it was 860 million at the end of the day, of dollars to our effort. But we had to go to the state and seek another roughly $300 million, about 194 million net present value funded in cash from the state. And as you might imagine, we did that in May, I think it was 2014, coming into a state legislature. There was a lot of hostility on just the whole concept. There were a lot of dangling participles and declarative phrases that began with four-letter words and ended with ing. And this is meeting state legislatures in the out communities of Lapeer, Leelanau, Traverse City. You know, why am I going to spend money on Detroit? They made their bed, let them lie in it. This is their problem. Expletive, delete it. I'm not going to do anything. And a lot of fingers right in your face. And what we tried to do in the first week was sort of the Zen of management, which was absorb a lot of that invective and try to hear them therapeutically, hear what the issues were. And they were right. I'm going to have to go back to my district and say, here's a city that just has a mayor that's going to jail, and I'm going to give them several $100 million. Why is that in my interest? So for the second week, what we tried to do is say, well, I acknowledge and validate what you're saying, but let me give you the business case. If you don't do this, then within the next decade, the cost to the state in terms of social services, SNAP, Medicare, Medicaid, all those things, it's going to be $3 billion. It's going to be 10 times the amount we're requesting now, and less than that in net present value. And that's just demographic trends. It has nothing to do with your belief. And I'd like to think that after you got through that process and developed a rapport with them and tried to address it just from a business standpoint as opposed to emotional or political standpoint, that cooler heads prevailed. And we eventually were able to get that funding from the state, understanding that Randy Richardson, it was the Senate Majority Leader, Chase Folger, who was on the House side. Chase had a bruising election with some of the public safety unions down in Detroit. He was not happy with Detroit at all. They had attacked his family. But we like to say that having gone through that, we were able to get to a point of stasis based upon relationships that we built over time and credibility, where the state legislature finally said, you know, it's not so much that it's in Detroit's interest, it's in our interest. It's in our collective interest. And we have to be a little bit smart. This may sting a little bit, but it's the right thing to do. So those relationships and getting people to a point of reflection, ability to step back from the invective and some of the vitriol, at least in my instances, we ran into the same thing in some of the private sector matters I've worked on. I remember hearing from a number of unions, no one will ever buy a car from a bankrupt automaker again when we were doing Chrysler. Well, that was in 2008, 2009, Chrysler put out the car of the year, Ram 1500. So if you can build on those relationships and build some credibility and try to get to a point explaining this isn't in the interest of my side, this is in your interest, sometimes that could be helpful.
Thank you. And Rip, would you like to talk about your schematic about the roles the roles that each of the sectors play in big change like this, or moving forward a vision for a city? Because that's a really important aspect of this conversation.
You know, Ellen, I think when I talk about the Detroit experience and the 5 or 6 years before the bankruptcy, and then the coalition around the $800 million fund that was the grand bargain, and then all of the effort post-bankruptcy. People always say, well, that's fine. You've got Kresge Foundation. It's a $4.5 billion foundation. What happens in a community where you don't have that available? And I think I would play back to our friends in Milwaukee that in some ways, the kind of relationships that you've built with the GMC, with Milwaukee United, have taken years and years and years to build. But if each of the sectors sort of stays in their lane, I'm not sure how valuable it will be. You will have picked a bunch of issues in which the unique assets of the private sector or the unique assets of the philanthropic sector can make real progress. And Julia's run through of the work that you've done is really impressive. I mean, there's just full stop. I mean, but at the end of the day, what I think really complex problem solving involves, and it's not just on the municipal finance side, which Kevin has described, but just issues of racial disparities, economic opportunity, youth development, all of the things that are going to matter into the future generations of Milwaukee. You're going to have to blur those lanes. You've got to sort of essentially reverse engineer, say, we're going to come at this problem. This is the problem we want to come at. And the private sector can put capital in the following ways, but they can't do this. And so maybe the philanthropic sector can convene people, and maybe the public sector can use its legitimacy to sort of bring people to the table in a different way. I think what we have found time and time and time again is you build the relationships first so that people trust you. And clearly that exists on this call. But then you, I think, begin to sort of sort out who has what tools that need to be aligned against an issue, in what proportions, in what sequence, and over what period of time. And it sounds so simple, but it's unbelievably hard. I mean, just a quick example, we're trying to do a preschool through college campus on an old abandoned historically Black college and university campus. We've got the Detroit Public Schools, we've got the City of Detroit, we've got the University of Michigan, we've got the philanthropic sector, we've got private donors. And that kind of master project management is hugely difficult and hugely important. And so I guess what I would say is that if you can combine relationships with the sort of process of reverse engineering, and then take the additional step of trying to identify who in community has the legitimacy and the credibility and the capacity to sort of project manage, then I think you're sort of on your way. And that's why I think relationships in and of themselves aren't enough. They've got to be supplemented by sort of strategic vision, the ability to sort of take things apart and put them back together. And then again, to sort of relinquish a little bit of power and authority. Forgive me if I'm getting thunder in the background, I apologize.
I think that storm moved across the lake because we had it here earlier today. So let me just pick up on one thing, and then I'm going to invite others to join in the conversation, which is first of all, I have to thank you and acknowledge your long-term support of Milwaukee United, which is our big vision about how to not only engage in a broader, more prosperous community for everyone, to build on the prosperity of downtown and drive it into the surrounding neighborhoods. And you have been a longtime supporter of that, and we would never have gotten as far as we have without not only your financial support, but also the technical resources and partnership and being part of the learning network of that you have brought together. So really want to appreciate and acknowledge that. The other portion of that is the community engagement aspect of this. Who gets to make the decision? Who gets to prioritize the use of money? We are about to enter into an era of the biggest investment of public resources in every city in America through the ARPA funds. So each of you have had your own experience in how the prioritization of resources gets to play out at the local level. And certainly, Rip, you have supported our efforts to really engage deeply in community engagement and really power shifting. So could each of you, Kevin, maybe you could start with that about how you address the issue of dealing with constituent needs in Detroit and prioritizing the use of public resources.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. I mean, I'd like to think of myself as a pretty reasonable guy, but I'm not above using combat tactics to get the job done. So what we tried to do when we were going to the pensioners who had to vote for our plan, by the way, and initial predictions were that we were going to lose miserably and the effort would fail, was try to explain to them what the options were and why it was in their interest to vote yes. We got that vote. It was about 70+%, was about 30% higher than I thought. But something you pointed out, Ellen, I think is really critical. Maybe the ARPA funds won't all come in at 3.5 billion, but we've got 1 billion in the pocket they've got to appropriate for. But the city has a 6-year capital plan and several capital projects that are ongoing, the HOP, some of the other things that are going on right now too. What I tried to do was to bring together the various parties. So in the ecumenical community and in the neighborhood activist community, I tried to say, yes, you have ideological underpinnings and now it may be defund the police or social equity, whatever. But what I'm talking about is that kid, oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. What I'm talking about is that kid that's in 5th grade today, within the next 5 to 6 years is going to be looking for a job. So given the flow of funds that may be coming for some of the projects that are already on the book, shovel ready, we have to be focused on really building the city for them. Okay, so they have useful jobs and we can bring them in at apprentice level jobs, electrician, bricklayer, whatever, they get to become a skilled trade. So part of the public-private partnership, but also the activists was bringing them all together and saying, let me give you a vision of how this can work now for city residents, but also for your progeny, for the benefit. You can still have your ideological underpinnings and your differences of view, but there are funds coming in, and not just ARPA. There's also CDBG, Community Development Block Grant, Section 108. There, we had over 300 million in funds of federal grants that were coming into the city that we could use also for CDBG, which is very flexible. So be quite frank about it, we tried to find a way so that everyone saw some benefit of a fashion in the process and therefore bought in. And we were pretty strategic about that and making sure that we told them, if you vote for us, you will get this. If you don't, you won't. It's just that simple. It's retail politics.
Ellen,
Kevin, Rip?
Yeah, I was just going to say, as I think about how Detroit is handling this huge infusion of ARPA dollars, it seems to me it sort of aims at a sort of a slightly larger point, is that what Detroit is going to do with this first tranche is plug holes, right? It's going to figure out ways to kind of get by, make sure that no harm has been done, and to invest in politically tangible things right now. And absolutely, not only is there nothing wrong with that, it's virtually inevitable. But what I think Detroit and Milwaukee and other places that are not necessarily as research rich as the coast need to start doing is figuring out which of those become a bridge to something a little bit more transformational. How do you invest not just in the transaction of a new park or a new mural or a new whatever it is, but try to figure out what is it that you can create? What machinery can you create that will take those monies in the future and make them something even larger? Let me just give you a quick example, if I might. It's that in 2008, 2009, 2010, we created in Detroit a fund called the New Economy Initiative. And it was a $100 million fund of aggregated capital from Ford, Kellogg, Kresge, and a bunch of other foundations. And for the first 2 years, we went in search of deals, trying to figure out how we would invest in deals. And it got us virtually nowhere. I mean, the deals were okay, but they kind of started and they petered out. And it became really clear that we had no machinery of entrepreneurialism. We had no system for encouraging entrepreneurs, providing them with technical support, connecting them to other entrepreneurs, setting them up with early stage seed capital, whatever it was. And so we spent the next 5 years creating a system of entrepreneurship, an infrastructure of entrepreneurship. And I've got to tell you, if there is one thing that has carried Detroit over the last decade, it is the small business community, because the autos have had their ups and their downs, and they took a while to get back into the game. But the power of these small community-based businesses over time, adequately resourced through this machinery of change, made all the difference in the world. And what I've suggested to Mayor Duggan, I don't know if he's interested, is that we need to figure out something similar. Early childhood education. We need a machinery to sort of sustain early childhood development. Small business development that actually reaches communities of color. It sounds like you guys are well along that path, and that's terrific. Figuring out how to invest in and sustain public open space over the long term. You know, a one and done doesn't work. It gets overgrown, people forget about it, it gets lost in the larger system, on and on and on. And I think it's a variation on what Kevin was saying earlier, is that you take stock, and you do what you need to do in the moment, but you also simply have to bridge into the future. And, you know, we just aren't very good at that. That's politically tough. And from what I can see in Milwaukee, you guys are ahead of the curve on this. You've at least identified those building blocks that you need into the future that you ought to invest in. And if we get an infrastructure bill, and if we get a reconciliation bill, whatever that's called, the Build Back Better bill, boy, I hope we don't sort of squander it on sort of short-term political benefit. We've just got to build for the long term.
Well, I really appreciate both of those comments, because I do think that the tendency may be to invest in early projects, early wins, very visible things, and the systemic change that needs to take place for sustainability is what you're both addressing. I know that we have learned some of the lessons and borrowed some of the systemic work that you're doing in Detroit, both in early childhood education and certainly in small business development through the Brew City Match, and our long-term planning, which of course you helped connect us with Tony Griffith. So we have a plan that we're working on, but I love the focus on really systems, building the systems to carry out the work over the long term. So I don't see any questions in the chat. So please, Kevin.
There was one thing I was going to add on Rick's comment, is that, you know, we put a lot of weight on our states and our cities to cooperate, and our chambers and our foundation communities, you know, and people always say, well, you know, what about foundations? And I always tell them, well, to tell you what it is, imagine what the city of Detroit would have been without a Kresge, without a Greater Southeast Michigan Foundation, okay, without Alberto Ibarra, without the foundation community, you know, take that out of the equation, imagine. So that's how important it is. But I don't want to let the federal government off the hook. I know they're carrying a lot of weight right now. We have not had an urban policy summit or task force in a long time. We have all this great intellectual commitment, effort, experience, what works, what doesn't work. And we've never had a clearinghouse to pull it together so that we can say, here's the bogey, here's the metric, early childhood development, maternal fetal health, housing requirements. Here's what we want to go to. And not a punitive sense, but here's the best practices that we found as supposedly the smartest country in the history of the world. And this is what we should assist, both in intellectual capital, but also in ARPA funds or in a reconciliation bill, whatever. This is how we should do that. I really think we need to get together to pull together all of the resources that we have to come up with sustainable solutions. We're sort of doing this ad hoc. You know, this city's going to do this, and they have this support, and this city's going to do that, but there's no real goal, because if we don't, we're at one of those inflection points. For the better part of our existence post-war in the United States, there were three economic engines. There was United States, Germany, and Japan. There wasn't a Russia. Okay, it was going through various iterations of the Cold War. There wasn't a China. It was an agrarian society. India was desperately poor. There wasn't a Brazil. but we comprise 5% of the world's population. The other 95% is coming online. This is beyond our petty beefs as the United States. This has to do with our ability to compete internationally going forward for the next century. If we don't, the next century will look a lot different than the century that I grew up in, where the United States was looked at as the pole star of economic development, of civil rights, of making itself better and forming a better union. Other people are looking to fill that space. If we don't do it, nature abhors a vacuum, someone will.
Thank you. I love the idea of having a summit to bring together all the best ideas about urban policy. This is a moment in time that really should happen. I heard a conversation earlier today about OMB using a racial equity lens to score some of the work that they're doing, but that's a whole different issue than what you're talking about.
Right.
So there is a question in the chat. I know we are running out of time. We could probably be here all afternoon. We would love to have you all afternoon, and I hope you will come back soon and often. So I know we only have 1 minute left, but one of the questions is, how did you retain the average resident's interest in Detroit and maintain them staying versus people who had a choice leaving?
Three things, I would say. First and foremost, I punched out a lot of reports. I'm not by nature a politician, but my public affairs guy said, when I was ruminating one day about I'm not a politician, he said, you need to grow up. You're just not elected. And one of your roles is to get this information out so that there's a better day coming. So once I embraced that concept of communicating to the public and transparency, things seem to accelerate. Number two, I had a lot of meetings with stakeholders and tried to give them a sense of myself and my sincerity and that I was committed to this effort, but I needed their help. We needed to be partners. So I tried to build alliances and relationships. And then number three, I tried to give them some vision of what success would look like. And that was really, if we do this right, this is what it's going to look like. And by the way, we'll return to the regular order and it'll be better. We'll have a water authority for our customers in the outlying counties instead of Detroit Water and Sewer billing them too much. You'll have a voice, you'll have governance. It'll be a better way. We got lucky. We got very lucky in that happened. And we're able to do 3 bond issuances during the course of the bankruptcy. I noted in Milwaukee, for instance, the rating agencies have dropped it 2 notches. Bonds, debt, lifeblood of a community, you have to address that. They are remarkably lithe. They are very, very, they have a lot of alacrity in changing once they have some credibility. So credibility, reporting out, and a vision for what success looks like. And by the way, as a point of personal privilege, Andrea Lee, thank you very much for your comment. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you both, Kevin and Rip, for this really outstanding discussion. And we really appreciate your time, your vision, your thoughtfulness, and your commitment to Milwaukee, both present and future. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Ellen.
Good to see you.
Bye, Rip. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Kevin. Bye-bye.
Bye, gang.
Bye. I'm not sure that's the end or what the heck.
Well, I guess I'm batting cleanup here, Ellen. Thank you, Rip and Kevin. You two are dynamic together, and your story is certainly motivating and inspirational. We greatly appreciate you sharing the strategy that led you through one of Detroit's most difficult times. Milwaukee does have some great collaboration, but it's wise to continue to build a strong foundation for these partnerships. Thank you, Ellen, for moderating. Your knowledge of the concept and collaboration was an important part of this meeting. Thank you again to our earlier guests, Ian, Michael, and Jasmine. Your commitment to collaboration has us on the right path. And as always, thank you, Dr. Amon, for your time. One last announcement, we're bringing back our racial equity book clubs this fall. Stay tuned for a sign up by the newsletter. The next meeting is October 11th, featuring Jeff Yabuki and Peggy Troy to discuss the importance of mental and behavioral health resources. This meeting is adjourned.